Thank you. Wow, it's a big audience. It's great to be here. I have some notes. Just very quickly, when I first became dean at Stanford Law School, I gave my first talk, and I had a member of the faculty, Barbara Babcock, who was very famous as the best speaker, like just the best speaker ever. And I came off, and she came up to me, and she put her hand on my shoulder, and she said, when you speak, some people it's good to speak from the heart, some people it's good to speak from notes. You should speak from notes. I do want to start by just noting that, what I'm going to say, Delphine said there might be disagreements. It's not so much a disagreement, at least, but I want to offer some perspectives that are kind of corollary to or qualifications on some of what you've heard. So I have a preface and then 3 points, just 3 quick points to make. The preface, I just want to say a couple things about strategic philanthropy, which is, and my perspective here, by the way, obviously mostly comes from my experience in the US, although we were a global funder. In fact, we funded all those women's funds. But my experience is mostly in the US, although from the observations I've been able to make since moving to London a year and a half ago, the differences are actually not as large as one might think. Strategic philanthropy is one of these terms that has become really controversial, mostly because people I'm speaking too fast, aren't I? People read into it lots of things that they want and take. There is a lot of bad strategic philanthropy, but the bottom line of it is simply 3 very simple things. If you're going to do philanthropy, you should have a clearly articulated goal. You should know what it is you're trying to achieve. You should have a story, a causal story about how you're going to use the resources of the foundation to achieve that goal, sometimes called a theory of change. And you should have some way of knowing whether you're getting there. And that's it. And within that, then, you can do any kind of philanthropy. There's room for it. It is stunning to me how often I still encounter philanthropists, though, who aren't even doing those 3 simple things. But buried inside that, and this is really the point I want to make in the preface, is a fundamentally pragmatic orientation, right? The ability to do philanthropy is such a privilege. The opportunity to have, however you got them, access to large resources that you can move in the world in ways that you choose is an incredible privilege, and with it comes an obligation to accomplish something good. And I want to emphasize that point. It's to accomplish something good. And that takes me to my first point, which I put here as against no-loafism. What I mean by that is this. There's an old expression, no loaf is better than a half. No, make that backwards. Half a loaf is better than none. And that's the point, right? Half a loaf is better than none. I would say in philanthropy, there is a huge number of people who actually are what I call no-loafers, for whom actually no loaf is better than a half. That is to say, they'll go about the way they do philanthropy, and it's so important because they're so right. It's so important to just stick to what they're doing in the way they want to do it, that even if it's not going to accomplish anything, they're still going to do it. And we see a lot of that these days. Some of it you could call performative, just performative philanthropy, as we see in so many other places. But much of it is in some ways worse. It's that I know what is the right thing, and I'm just going to fund it, even if the way I'm doing it and what I'm going about doing is exacerbating the problem and actually making it worse. And we're going to dig in, and we're going to keep doing that. I'll give you my favorite example is much of the funding in the US on the democracy problem takes this perspective. So the focus will be on certain issues. There are the number of issues and problems and ways in which our democracies are not working. There are just many, many of them. So people will choose the thing that they want to work on, and they will just say, I'm just going to fix that, and no matter what. That's the problem. I'll give you a couple of examples. Voter ID laws in the US were one example. There's something called drop boxes were another. Now, in each of these areas, the problem wasn't, obviously voter ID laws actually had some negative effects. Drop boxes, I don't know if you know what those are. That's where if you live in a rural area, so you can't necessarily go all the way to a municipal area to vote, there'd be a box where you could leave your ballot and somebody would come pick it up later. And obviously it makes it much easier for people who live in distant rural areas to vote. So people on the left really wanted them. People on the right were worried that they would be easy places for fraud, and same thing with voter ID. Now, instead of thinking, what can we do to get drop boxes in ways that actually address the concerns that people have about fraud. Whether they're grounded or not is in some ways the point. Even if they're wrong, what does it matter if they're wrong? If there's a way I can address it that will bring their support along so that I can get something done. And you saw a huge amount of unwillingness to just go down that path at all, because we knew we were right, we knew they were wrong, and we would just go ahead. And the inevitable consequence was to increase the polarization and increase the opposition on the other side, and quite often to take all of those people in the middle who you might have persuaded and alienate them. And that's what I mean about no-loafism. The idea is what we need to be thinking about is how do we accomplish our goals, even if that sometimes means working with people who we might not otherwise choose to work with, or even if it sometimes means changing the way in which we want to do it in order to make some progress, because half a loaf is better than none. Second point, on equality. And I picked points just to reflect the topic, the title of this conference. Because in some ways, the way we have gone about dealing with inequalities is a good example, often a good example of the kind of no-loafism that I'm talking about. Obviously, equality is a huge problem and something that we need to deal with as societies. And as a result, it is an obvious and critical place in which philanthropy can potentially make a difference. And yet the way we've been going about it has turned the question of inequality into a zero-sum game that just increases opposition to what we're trying to do, right? So if you focus on disadvantaged groups as if only their problems matter, that's the thing we need to address. And members of majority groups, they're either to blame, or their problems don't matter or are less important, or they're all racists or misogynists or whatever it is because they won't go the way we want to go. The inevitable consequence has been to increase opposition and make less progress than you might otherwise have made. And in the US, at least, it has been a major contributor to the rise of the Trump administration. Because what you had was a whole lot of people who thought about their lives and their problems as mattering and said, I don't see myself in here at all. I don't hear you talking to me. I don't hear you talking about me. And by the way, in the US, that has increasingly included people in the disadvantaged groups, because they themselves also don't want to just be reduced to their group. They wanted people to recognize that they have, and they share some of their problems with people across the society, and yet they don't hear themselves being spoken to that way or addressed in any way. I think what we need to do in thinking about equality then is stop thinking about it as a separate problem removed from others and recognize that it is a part of all of our problems. So if you want to deal, for instance, with the problem of democracy, we need to address the failures of democracy across the whole spectrum of people who feel like their voices aren't being heard. And while doing that, address the particular problems that some groups have in having their voices heard even less. If we're going to deal with the problems of wealth inequality, we of course need to think about the racial wealth gap, but we can't make it so that you either deal with the racial wealth gap or you deal with wealth inequality. And if you're dealing with wealth inequality, you're a racist because you're not facing up to the racial wealth gap. And that is how the debate has been framed. And we need to think about how do we think then about, reconstructing our economic policies in ways that will address the problems across the whole society while recognizing that some groups face systemic disadvantages that need to be addressed as part of that. If we're going to deal with climate, we can't have the climate justice groups in opposition to the rest of the climate movement, but need people to think about how do we address the climate problem, and while we do that, make sure that the costs of the transition aren't borne by the same people who always bear them. And that's a very different framing, and it will take you in different places in terms of who you might work with and how you might work, and we've had too little of that, and the result is, I think, a lot less progress than we might otherwise make. Point 3 is on power. The current approach to philanthropy is, to a large extent, heavily influenced by critical theory. What there is everything is power. Who has it, who doesn't? And if there is power in some group, the only solution to that power is to build countervailing power in order to take it away or reduce theirs. And by the way, don't hear me as denying that that's true. That is absolutely, of course, at least the first part, there is power, and some groups have it and other groups don't, and it is the thing we need to address. But the question is how. So the approach in philanthropy, which is to say the only how is through building countervailing power, has then led to a form of philanthropy in which all we think about is movement building. And this is the part where I'm not actually disagreeing. We funded those things, but there's more to it than that, and we're leaving out the other part, which is that ideas matter. Power doesn't just exist in the abstract. Ideas matter, and if you really want to change how people act, by far the best way to do it is to change how they think. And we see so little of it. One of the reasons I left the philanthropy world and went back to LSE was I was frustrated in being in a world where it seemed like nobody actually cared about ideas. All they cared about was power building, and that's where the field seems to have gone in recent years. So if we want to change how people think, then it's a different kind of investment. And it's harder, and it's slower, and it's a lot less certain, right? Particularly in the world we have today where there's so much noise out there. But if you think about how incredibly effective it can be, in truth, I think if you look and you think about the single most powerful and effective philanthropy that was ever done since modern philanthropy emerged at the beginning of the 20th century, it is the conservative funding of neoliberalism. That changed the world in incredibly powerful ways that we're still living with now. We're just now beginning to hopefully climb out of it. And as we get into the incredible political disruptions that happen when an intellectual paradigm breaks down, which is what we're in now, and people start to drift to the next best explanations before them, the problem we have is we haven't given people one. So they're drifting towards ethno-nationalism. They're drifting towards models of illiberal democracy because we haven't provided one, because we haven't been investing in ideas the same way that the conservatives did when they built this edifice in the first place. And you see examples of this all the time. I mean, the other easy and obvious example that I think people are familiar with was the movement for same-sex marriage. As long as they approached it as just a power-building exercise, they made very little progress. It was when they understood that they needed to change the way people thought about LGBTQIP+ people that they began to make progress in the US, at least, and achieved real progress. They got people to think differently about the people who were seeking this right, to think less about demands that they be given equal rights and more about how they were people just like them who wanted opportunities to be in loving relationships. And you can come up with lots of examples. Again, the point for me is just, again, it's not that we shouldn't be investing in movement building, it's that it has to have as a corollary, though, changing how people think and not just trying to overbear them. So those, for me, would be the sort of three main takeaways that I would hope people want to think about as they think about doing philanthropy in a world which absolutely feels like it's falling apart. Thank you very much.